Hello. We're back. We've got another episode of Connect This on tap. And this is our second episode, Sans Travis, which I thought I would say Sans because he would probably make fun of me for using Latin. Travis got pulled away at the last second. So we're going to be taking this without him being able to offer that rich perspective that he offers. And if this is your first show and you're just tuning in because you love Deb, then this is how we always do things. And it's totally normal. So don't worry about it. I'm Christopher Mitchell at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance in St. Paul, Minnesota. This is a show I've had in my notes for a long time because I was hoping that these two characters would engage in verbal combat, unlike anything that anyone's ever seen before. Only in the pre-show, it seems like they're both reasonable people who just want to find good solutions to interesting problems. So we may not have that. So let me introduce Deborah St-Pierre from Althea, co-founder of Althea. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
It's wonderful to have you back. I feel like you have both been on the Community Broadband Bits podcast and on other versions of the show as we were kind of moving into the direction of it. So it's just great to have you back on the screen again.
Yeah,
And then we also have Sasha Meinrath, who has been a guest on Connect This previously. Sasha is the Palmer Chair in Telecommunications at Penn State and founder of XLab. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. I'm only here because Deb's here. I mean, I didn't realize I was supposed to verbally joust, but I was hoping to fanboy instead. Is that okay?
It's flannel.
I feel like there could be some interesting jousting at Penn State. Like, I don't know if you and Chris Ali are going to start like some kind of big feud or something to make things interesting. But Dr. Chris Ali is now at Penn State. So I feel like a lot of people, when they found out he was going there, were like, what happened to Sasha? Assuming there couldn't be two of you.
Oh, no, we're building an army of political economists here. Stay tuned.
Wow.
Yes. So I feel like for people who are not as familiar with these two folks, it is really worth noting that that you are both people who think well outside the box, who recognize not just some of the problems with the system that can be sort of fixed, with kind of patchy solutions or like minor adjustments, but thinking of whole different ways that we can try to solve some of the issues, which I think you would identify perhaps as just making sure everyone has high quality internet access. I think that's right.
Yeah, I think also too, one of the reasons why you find that is because if you have like deep examination of the fundamental issues, like why do we feel like telcos aren't working? Why do we feel like folks don't have internet? And then if we can rewind it back, and I think Sasha and myself are maybe come from those like wildly outside the box scenarios because of that sort of deep analysis.
Sasha, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I mean, it's absurd to live in such a rich country where we've taken for granted things like everyone gets access to roads, primary education, and we haven't moved in the direction of universal, ubiquitous, free baseline connectivity for everyone. So, that's for 20 years been saying, hey, that's what we need. Times have changed. We've won the battle that it's an essential service. We are far from universalizing that service. And now the question is, can we move the Overton window to talk about free connectivity as a part of what it means to live in a civil society?
I'd like to add a little bit to that. I think also, I think from our perspective, we look at it from a perspective of ownership as well. So you could have free access, but the ways that, companies might monopolize that access using your data or having a free tier of like Facebook, Twitter, and WhatsApp and having the rest of the internet be paywalled can happen if we aren't careful about how we look at the models within the internet itself and who's owning that. And for me, ownership means choice. Are you able to participate in that economy? Are you able to participate in how you interact with that medium? So a lot of, I think what we look at, like when we're building tools for communities, is like, how can we empower that ownership for both the user and the community who's building it?
Yeah, and I want to subtract from a little bit of what Sasha said rather than adding to it. And but I want to know also, Deb, what you added on is something that I think about a lot, which is when Sasha says free, a lot of time I think he's speaking both free as in beer and free as in freedom, right? And I think it's important to keep that in mind as we're going through this, to make sure we keep that in mind. Now, when Sasha says free, my skin doesn't crawl as much as when some other people do, because I get super nervous when people that I think have correctly identified the problem want to just abstract away the real costs and the fact that someone does have to pay for this. And they may not have spent the years working on these models in the way that I know Sasha has. So I just wanted to note that there are people who are like, well, let's just make it free. And in their mind, they're just sort of like, yeah, we'll like tax millionaires some more and we'll pay for it that way. And it's not an unreasonable approach, but it's one that I don't feel like is sophisticated enough to just make happen. So I just wanted to know, I think when Sasha, you're saying free, and I think we've talked about this before, then say a little bit more about how we'll be able to accomplish that without going into the kind of spyware and kind of abuses of personal data that Deb noted.
That's right. Right. So the dominant free model being that you're actually selling a little bit of your soul in the terms of privacy and, your most innermost thoughts, behaviors getting like shunted off to third parties. That's not what I'm talking about, obviously. I'm talking about civil society making the investment as a society. And there's two main reasons to do this, right? One is that there's an immediate return on making those investments, but there's also this opportunity cost. We're paying billions, tens of billions, and over the course of the last few decades, hundreds of billions in dollars in terms of subsidies and et cetera directly. So we're already paying an arm and a leg. We're overpaying for the service we have, but also there's this opportunity cost that I think COVID made very clear. That if we don't make this investment, we're foregoing. And we're foregoing things like elevated housing prices and therefore tax income, but we're foregoing, good health outcomes, education, like writ large. I mean, huge opportunity cost to society that if we took the opportunity cost versus the investment, you'd realize to not make this investment is going to cost us more as a society. And therefore, it's not only just I'm talking about free connectivity to everyone. I'm saying like this is the wise choice for taxpayers everywhere.
I agree. I made a funny face there for a second, which I often do when Sasha's speaking. But in this case, it was because Travis entered the backstage. He says the issue is resolved. So welcome, Travis.
Oh, sorry, guys. I'm late. I'm sure I missed a lot, so I'll be quiet and not.
Well, no, so you missed. I'll recap what you missed. You missed that the system is broken, and there are ways to fix it that don't involve us having to just pay off the big companies or beg them for crumbs that involve them using our data in ways that we don't want. And we're sort of heading in the direction of talking about, I think, some of the philosophy as to like why we're doing this work. But where we're going to dive in is the meat of the show. And that is how some technologies that are becoming available may offer different paths forward for how we can achieve this vision. So, I mean, I think there's a political dimension to it. There's other dimensions to it. But we're going to talk more about the technology, I think, for the rest of the show. Before we do that, Travis runs USI Fiber in in Minneapolis, and you had an issue, but it's resolved now. So you can.
All good. It was not a technical issue. It was just a logistical issue. It's more construction related, but we can delve on that later. So I don't want to miss out on the meat and potatoes here.
Cool. So Deb, we're going to move now to sort of discussing wireless technology specifically, although we don't think that's the only way. Althea is doing a lot with fiber optics, but I want to talk specifically about unlicensed and licensed, and more specifically LTE technology versus other kinds of wireless technologies. And when I have advocated and worked with tribes to help them build 2.5 gigahertz networks and to connect tribes that are doing that sort of a thing, I've largely done it because I viewed it as the best tool, not because I thought LTE was a particularly good tool, but because thanks to the work of a number, and Harold, I mean, I'm just saying this because I'm ignorant. I'm not in a position of the technical sophistication to judge whether or not it's a good tool. But it's a tool that's available because of the tribal priority window, which policy-minded folks spent years trying to make sure that some tribes would actually be able to use this spectrum over their land, which is often not being used and they're prohibited from using. And so it became available, and I kind of dove into it just because it was a tool that was available. And I've come to appreciate that you would make a case that this is actually the really great tool that they would want, and not just a tool that happens to be available. So do you want to speak for a few minutes about why LTE is the right tool in these areas?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for the opportunity. And I think it really comes down to how we authenticate and how we talk to different devices. So we used to think about internet as like we deliver it to the home, and then there'd be a router in the home and it delivers to all these devices. And for the most part, the remainder of our connectivity was either at work, or it was at home, or at school. And there wasn't really a lot in between. But that's changed, is changing, and is extremely exciting. We have connected vehicles. You have smart cities, sensors that give us lots of great information. There's precision agriculture that allows us to, save on fertilizer and water. There's camera technology, and there's all of this. And then, of course, our handsets, where predominantly that's where most of us are interacting with the internet on a daily basis, is in, our handset.
Unless you're someone like me that has 3 giant monitors and on his wall and refuses to deal with the little screens and the tinier keyboards.
You do have to realize that the younger generation is more increasingly
wrong. They're wrong. That's what you're saying,
right? So when we think about connectivity, like real connectivity, empowering connectivity holistically like that, then a direct connection to the home is very limited. But with SIM-based authentication, we can connect to all kinds of devices on the same sort of radio. One radio connects to all of these. And, we start getting into really fun like eSIMs, or we get into like 5G where you can have multiple active SIMs. And what gets really exciting is, number one, you can connect your whole community. Like, this is a smart community now with LTE technology. And 2, you can do it in ways that are more private. You don't have to collect as much data about people. And I think that's a lot about what we work on, is just how do we, authenticate into the network and not have to have all of that sort of stored in a centralized way.
Well,
so
can I interrupt
you? Go ahead.
Can we, before we dive into that, because I think that's really important, I want to make sure people have a sense of, and you can tell me that I'm wrong. I think of LTE and how I kind of expected this conversation to go originally, before I got a sense that Sasha, has different points of view necessarily, was that it's sort of like we have one type of technology, which is like command and control, right? Where you have like a central network and it determines who can be on the network and what they can do. And then we have other technologies, kind of like Wi-Fi, which are kind of like anyone can do whatever they want as long as they follow some basic rules and no one can tell them not to do that. And it's probably a gross oversimplification. And I expected, first of all, Deb, you've long been saying that LTE is actually a great opportunity for decentralization, and that kind of confused me, those things. But I know that let's stop there for a second and say, is that a good way to think about a difference between the types of wireless technologies? One is sort of centralized command and control, and the other one being much more anarchistic. And Sasha, you can go ahead and jump in.
That has more to do with the business model and other sort of statutory mandates about surveillability and, copyright enforcement and things of that ilk than it has to do with any particular frequency. I will say that what we have seen is, for example, over just the last dozen years, cell phones, which used to have sort of a command and control sort of infrastructure mode and then a more distributed ad hoc mode, from the operating systems of the cell phones themselves, they've quietly removed the ability to directly communicate with each other. That was a business decision that was made. The technology, in essence, was made worse over time. But in essence, because technology has moved so far, computers have gotten so fast, the code bases have gotten a lot more stable. The possibilities today for distributed communications in many ways are quite a bit larger than they were even a dozen years ago. And we were doing kind of second generation deployments of distributed cellular infrastructure. And to me, that's a huge opportunity. It's the same issue, which is like when we first did the cost of connectivity report back when I was running the Open Technology Institute, we were documenting how Americans were paying such a premium, so much more than we should for existing service in fewer locations. And so the idea of having a distributed infrastructure that's community owned and operated that addresses some of the surveillance problems we have seen consistently targeting exactly the same communities that have the least connectivity today, that's a big issue. But also lowering the overall costs is a big issue. And then on top of that, you've got this network effect, which is that the value of the network increases, let's say exponentially based on the number of people on the network. So for communities where only a couple of people have telephones, it's not very useful. It's only useful when everyone has a telephone. And therefore, we had a universal service mandate for phones in this country for decades and decades and decades. We're not doing that with this medium. And we're certainly not doing that with the internet, much to the detriment of all of society.
Right. No, I feel like I want to make sure that I would give Deb a chance to respond to my technological understanding. I do also want to note that I feel like one of the reasons we're not having that universal service is I think policymakers might say that they're trying to do that in a market-based system. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this show. We all have strong opinions about that, but I do want to focus more on the technology here. But I'll just surface that there are challenges because of decisions that were made in the past that we don't want to revisit to resolving those. Not to say there's not paths forward, but that'll be a different show, I think.
Well, but if I may, right before Deb jumps in, the reason why technology is being made worse today is to prevent people like Deb from saying, hey, we can actually do this very easily and have community-owned infrastructure. They have to work hard to keep us from utilizing these technologies. There's a multi-million-dollar effort to prevent folks from using technology in a better manner. And so into that, I feel like Deb's work is so vitally important because she's working in exactly the opposite direction, making technology accessible.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate that and 100% agree with you. And one of the things you were talking about is the cost. And I thought that was really interesting. So from a carrier's perspective, the average cost to acquire a telco customer is $1,000 and their ARPU is less than $40 a month.
For a mobile wireless customer?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I think when we think about it for this perspective, in fact, for the carriers, the system is broken as well. And so they're trying to do things like you said, make it really hard, spend policy money. Google makes their operating system harder or Apple especially, to interact with. But maybe other forces I see where private networks, private LTE, private 5G, and then community networks like this are pushing on that, making the business case that there are better ways to leverage that. And I think for a carrier, if they can access a customer for less than that $1,000, it's pretty compelling. So really what we try to find is where does that alignment where we can make that happen? Because right now, I don't think it's really working for carriers either. They're heavily debt-based capital to build out networks. And with 5G, it's expensive.
Let me redirect my question then to say specifically in a non-wordy way. I feel like in my mind, we want to have permissionless innovation in networks where people can do things without having to ask permission to the network owner. To me, LTE does not seem permissionless. It seems like we're just kind of have local warlords rather than a big AT&T or Verizon.
But yet, I mean, I think it's changed to Sasha's point very, very rapidly. The CBRS made licensed spectrum more accessible for everyone. 2.5 gigahertz did work on open source cores. Of course, we had Druid before, and now we had Magma, and Open 5GS has really propelled innovation in lightweight edge core for LTE. So I think
these are systems that work, though. I mean, like, I've sometimes wondered. I don't have the visibility. Deb, you have a business. Your business depends on these technologies,
right. Yeah, and we're early. So anytime technology is early, the first few years are interesting. But yeah, they're working. I mean, people are running these things, and in fixed wireless primarily. I think one of the things that isn't here yet is the IoT devices that connect to LTE. So your smart farms, your precision farms, that kind of stuff isn't quite there yet. So this is where innovation needs to happen. It's also I don't know if I can dive into this really quickly, but it's interesting right now as we are phasing out 4G and going to 5G. The cost is so much different. Everyone's having to make this choice between, do we really focus on innovating in 5G? Do we, while we're still trying to make our bread and butter?
Who, the carriers or the people that are supporting equipment? Who's the who in your, like, when you say we?
I think anyone who is looking at deploying LTE technology.
Okay, so infrastructure owners, network providers.
Yeah. So if you're a tribe that's looking at that, if you're a business saying, okay, do I put in, private LTE or this new private 5G, all of this, because in 2 years, are you going to rip and replace? And it's pretty spendy.
So let me, more specifically though, it seems to me that like you have a given chunk of spectrum. And like we could manage it. And again, I might be oversimplifying. You tell me if I am. I never know where my hands are on the camera. It's all reversed. But you have a chunk of spectrum. And I feel like you have an option of being like, all right, everyone can sort of use it as long as they listen first and sort of move forward in that way. Or we could have someone that controls it and they determine it. Am I oversimplifying, or is this like, because this is the part that gives me the most nerves about embracing an LTE future?
Yeah, I mean, we could dive into the weeds. You've got different contention protocols for, unlicensed, like Wi-Fi has a very interesting and not very efficient contention protocol so that multiple people in a cafe can all get online. It wastes a bit of time. And then you've got sort of different mechanisms, time and frequency divisioning of a command and control infrastructure. But there's two elements here. One's the command and control of devices connecting to a central node, and the other is the command and control of the network as a whole. So you can have the best of both worlds. You can have an ad hoc network with time division duplex, where you've sliced up the pie very cleanly to edge devices, let's say to a distributed network where these are all handled separately. And this isn't hypothetical, right? Anyone that's done first responder work knows that we've got a variety of distributed infrastructure by fire departments, police departments all over the country that have a very command and control thing, but they own and command and control that particular infrastructure. And I think where Deb and I are on the same pages, we're like, well, we should capture those same efficiencies, cost effectiveness, and communications universality for communities, for tribes, for anyone that wants to deploy that kind of infrastructure. So one doesn't have to choose between like totally ad hoc Wi-Fi-esque kind of stuff and totally centralized command and control. There's variance in between.
Yeah, we oftentimes call them broadband Legos, right? You should be able to stock and build what you need to build for your community.
And so, Deb, you've embraced LTE, and I'm curious. I'll say that one of the things that I get about particularly 5G over LTE, but understanding is that, as Sasha had mentioned, Wi-Fi can be less efficient, but you can do a lot of interesting things. And it makes sense to me, that you'd want to do that in a factory or places like that, where you have some devices that have certain characteristics and other devices that have far different characteristics. I can see how that would also work, in a house, on a farm. I don't see how a central manager makes sense. Like someone who's running a network for 1,000 households, how they can make decisions about all of those devices. And I worry about how one can decentralize that back down to the household having control over it. So can you walk me through a little bit how you think about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I completely understand how you're thinking about like managing those devices. And one of those things, that is kind of one of the problems, is that there isn't a lot of visibility onto all the different, IoT like devices at the edge, right? This is a little bit what we get when we have the improvements with 5Gs. We do get more visibility, and it's really interesting too, because I heard the statistics actually that the majority of devices on LTE networks are actually fixed. So you can tell the network that you wanted the fixed to have certain properties and not switch between the radios as much. And then you can tell, hey, I can see this kind of device is an Android phone, roam between different things.
But a TV is not going to be moving around, and you could tell that.
Exactly. So there is that kind of discretion that we can build into the protocols that really make it work best for each device there. And then the other thing I think it's really interesting is that you can sort of set each device to have different profiles. Say, if I want to have it be part of a private network, when it's in a private network, I want to be part of a Wi-Fi network, and I can prioritize those. And then when I want to go into public roaming, I can public roam. And then the other thing that this enables is potentially in the future, we can have inbound roaming. So that tribe could actually earn revenue from, people coming into the area with their phones and roaming onto their network and paying them like a carrier. So this division between like a community network or municipal network and a public carrier like AT&T, I think is going to get blurred. Now, this is probably years of work still left ahead of us, but
probably it's not going to happen next month.
Well, we're going to keep pushing on it as hard as we can, but I think that's huge. That hugely changes the way that we think about networks in general.
It looked like you wanted to say something, Sasha, but I have a related question to that follows up to that.
So fundamentally, it's important to also understand there is no spectrum scarcity. Spectrum and spectrum utilization is one of these weird natural resource that renews nanosecond to nanosecond to 100%, which means any nanosecond that you're not fully utilizing your spectrum is just lost to the space-time continuum.
Now, Sasha, are you saying that specifically in the sense that, like, if the FCC changed everything about the way it's doing, or even within the FCC's current management, that there is no spectrum crunch?
I'm saying people would be shocked to learn how inefficiently we use this resource and
even
how
what's available to. So, like, you're not talking about like having to repurpose DoD spectrum, right? Even within the stuff that's available to us, it's still very inefficiently used, is what you're saying, I think.
Yeah, I mean, if you basically said, hey, look, if you're not using it for your X, Y, and Z corporate network, that it should be made available on a nanosecond to nanosecond basis for free utilization, we would have a completely transformed digital ecosystem almost overnight. That obviously is a radical positioning in DC, where we are giving single licenses to single entities, even when they may not use a piece of spectrum at all for days, weeks, or years on end. And so you have all of these communities that have no cellular service in the United States today, lots of spectrum available that are prevented from accessing a resource that is not used solely because we have this archaic licensure spectrum. And I want us to be paying attention to that, because the other side of this is it's insane that we are not making more efficient use of the people's airwaves. And that too then plays into why people are trying to keep a lid on distributed technologies, on the possibility that communities can self-provision, et cetera. Deb is a major intervention that people don't want anyone to know about. Corporations don't want you to know that these technologies are not hypothetical. They're not science fiction. They're not down the road in the future. They're available right now today.
It's how people in Enfield, North Carolina are on the internet right now.
Use this one simple trick. Carry your data.
I want to get Travis's any questions Travis has in a second after I go with the one that I really am interested in, and that is if you go back to when we were transitioning from dial-up, which really in the early days of dial-up, it very much was a kind of like one computer to the service provider, right? And one of the things that was happening as we were looking at people having more computers in the home and having one connection out is something, and the story that I've heard is that Bob Frankston basically convinced Microsoft to implement NAT, network address translation, which then prohibited basically technically the ISP from seeing what was going on internally, thereby stopping the ISP from charging a household that has multiple devices, right? Because you're on your side of the NAT, you can put over however many devices you want, and you have that one connection going out, and the ISP has no visibility into what you're doing. You want to break that, and I feel like here's another an issue where you then have to go to the ISP, and I could be totally misunderstanding, but it strikes me that you have to get a SIM card, you have to like get that registered in their system, and I'm worried that we're giving them too much power, even if we trust many of them in this model.
And we fought this battle previously. AT&T used to rent every single phone in your house individually.
Right. It's not new.
Right. And that was ruled to be illegal, right? The 1968, et cetera, Carter phone decision, it was basically like, hey, now you can have your own phones. You can have many phones in one house.
Right. And let's just, and fitting with this conversation, I'll note it took me years after I learned about Carter phone to learn that Carter phone was a decision the courts forced on the FCC. The FCC was not on the side of the household. The FCC was on the side of AT&T, and it's worth remembering that. So Deb,
and Brand X, which pretty much eliminated common carriage in this space, is a deferral to the FCC, which is to say that the precedent from the Supreme Court is to say you're the expert agency, which is why the FCC could say, well, we're just going to bring back common carriage. I don't know if this is going to send Travis into epileptic seizures or not, but like the FCC could decide to bring back common carriage if they wanted to in this space and on cellular networks.
So Deb, why are you not ruining my my love of being able to have as many devices as I want on my side of the net?
Well, right, because and this is why, I mean, this is a little bit of a self plug here, but Althea basically put the core, the EPC, into the home router so that you could do that. That's the whole idea, is that you can build a little private network for your farm. I mean, a lot of what we were looking at was like farmers right now, right, when they have, their John Deere SaaS-based system, they have no control of their data and things like that we're doing. But what if we made it as easy to build a Wi-Fi network as an LTE network? So these things can be parsable, right? The way that we think about them. And then I also think the way that we authenticate right now with sort of a centralized database of IMSIs, where they know everything about you and what you're doing and all that sort of things, is also antiquated. And as more compute kind of comes to the edge, you could just do something like a public-private key pair that, that only looks, hey, do you have funds? Can you pay to connect to this network? And that's all that has to be. We can have more of a discrete sort of, encrypted connection instead of this really sort of centralized tubing. But, the internet's a series of tubes. I don't know if that makes sense, but
well, it makes sense on multiple levels. But to be clear, so what you're saying is that I'm thinking of an Althea network as being like one LTE system in which there's one entity that controls all of the devices, and you're saying no, you've distributed that. So
right.
A farm, an ag producer, more accurately perhaps, would be able to be a part of that network, but they are the ones that control all of the SIMs and things like that without having to get permission from the network owner.
Exactly.
Or in the same way that you might set up a wireless access point and have your own little network in your home or in your favorite cafe, you can do that with a cellular infrastructure and have all the benefits and interoperability with other cellular devices. And that, again, it's not some technology that's under development or may arrive in the future. This is like, you could do this today.
Yeah.
And, then you run into this problem of licensure, which is that you're de facto, electromagnetic jaywalking in the middle of like a field somewhere. And, that to me is a very interesting sort of civil disobedience.
Comes with a greater penalty than jaywalking.
Does it though? Do we know of anyone that's actually? I feel like it's enforced about as much as jaywalking.
Oh, that could be. Although I feel like there's a future where it gets enforced a lot more rigorously if people take you up on testing that.
That's right. I think that's right.
Travis, where do you want to plug in on this?
All right, so let me just bring this down to the reality of today.
Boo.
So, spectrum. Where do we get the spectrum to realize this vision? Practically.
So I think that to Sasha's point, it's very, it's extremely underutilized. It's not that it's not out there, right? So communities sort of pushing on access to that. Obviously, we have tribes now that have like band 41, which is 2.5 gigahertz. But
how much spectrum do they have available in that band?
Gosh, do you know, Sasha, off the top of your head?
2.5 is two bands that are just under 50 and one that's just under 20. So you got about 120 megahertz of space in there. And it's contiguous with 2.4. So the chipsets for 2.4 either today or very soon are just going to scan in all of those frequencies.
Now, hold on a second, Travis. Sorry, can I? Yeah. So you asked where are we going to get this, and it wasn't clear to me the extent to which Deb's answer was.
Yeah, that's what I want. Yeah, even though it's there, and I 100% agree with you. We live in Minneapolis and St. Paul, Mr. Mitchell and I, and we have spectrum that's allocated to the Navy specifically for use on aircraft carriers. Well, guess what? I've lived here 52 years. I have never seen an aircraft carrier here. And if you pull out a spectrum analyzer, there has never been even one bit of data moved over that spectrum. So I agree with you, but we are prohibited from using it. And it is not going to change. At least I haven't ever seen any momentum or initiative to actually have that change. The closest is CBRS. Which I will tell you from a user perspective or from a deployment step, the problem with it is the PALs were so expensive that no small ISPs or community could afford to buy them. So now the private ones, the public ones, there's not enough spectrum there to even be effective. You get a 10 or a 20 megahertz slice. I just want you to think about last night is an interesting evening. This hasn't happened since the Game of Thrones finale. But the Amazon is having the football episodes on Thursday night now, stream over Amazon. It will destroy this network that we're talking about if all we have is 10 and 20 megahertz slices.
Well, I would say that I think there's a few things sort of pushing on this thought, right? So some of our clients are building private LTE networks, right? And they're building it with licensed spectrum because they have the money. And it's saving them a lot because otherwise they're going to pay a carrier, right? They can build their own networks out.
Can you just define for a second what a private LTE network is?
Yeah, and how many users are on it too. That's really important here because if it's a half a dozen clients, that's one thing. If it's 70,000, that's another thing.
Sure. So what I'm saying is these are corporate entities that have 70, 100,000, hundreds of thousands of devices or, vehicles or clients or phones or whatever they're going to put on these networks. And that is that, to your point, we haven't seen a lot of movement in LTE spectrum, more democratized, and we haven't seen this flexible spectrum. But when the corporations are looking at, hey, I'm going to be spending billions of dollars in connectivity over the next 10 years, or I can build out my own network, then I think the equations start to look a little bit different. And the big thing about licensed spectrum, to your point, is power. Unlicensed spectrum is oftentimes lower power. It really does not have the ability to penetrate the foliage and be as useful as carrier licensed spectrum that has the power. So we not only have to get access to spectrum and access to spectrum in a wide enough bandwidth it matters, we also have to get those higher power.
By power, you mean volts and amps, just for other people who are struggling to follow.
Yeah.
I use power a lot, not to mean electricity.
So if I could jump in here also, it's important to remember there's sort of three levels to spectrum. One is like the allocation, which is saying like, okay, this is for television, this is for radio, this is going to be for cellular. The second one is the actual assignment. This is for your NPR radio station. This is for your local, PEG access television station. And the third is the actual use. And you experience actual use all the time when you're having to skip through all of those radio stations that don't exist, right? It's not like we have contiguous radio stations on your car stereo. You're going lots and lots of space isn't being used. Same with television. Those are the denser areas of this. When you actually do spectrum measurement, as the NSF has done, you find that it's single-digit utilization rates in some of the densest urban metro areas on the coasts. And that's the high point in the country, which is to say, especially in underserved communities, you're often looking at like low single-digit utilization rates, which is to say 99% of spectrum isn't being used millisecond to millisecond. We're just prevented by licensure, by allocation and assignment, from actually utilizing it. So
right. I think we all agree on that. I don't think there's an argument among even any of the people who are listening. If they're tuning into this show, I think they probably largely agree that the FCC should change the licensing approach to be much more rational. So if we all agree to that, what's the next step? Go ahead, Deb.
Well, one thing I was going to say here too, maybe this kind of leads on as well, is the technology isn't quite here to really utilize the spectrum in a dynamic way. Things like 5G slicing, and of course, whatever's going to happen with that in 6G, when we can start using frequency and bandwidth. I mean, carrier egg did a lot for us, carrier aggregation for being able to utilize the spectrum more efficiently. But we're really, because it was such a monopolistic carrier ballgame before, it was built for monopolistic telcos. What's exciting to me is that some of the newer LTE technology, some of what we're bringing in 5G, is going to help continue to push on that space and let us use what we have much more efficiently.
Now, that's years away, months away. I mean, like, are there, like, I know like Spencer, well, and I know that's like people like Spencer are out there, friends of ours who are doing this work. The issue of the labs being controlled by the monopolistic companies, basically, that are able to do a lot of this work is serious. And I'm curious, like, is this something that a few universities are going to be able to support, as well as I'm sure there's people around the world who are working on this in different ways, is this, let me take a step back, right? I remember like 15 years ago, I was telling my dad, like, everyone's going to be on Linux desktops in the future, right? Like how could we not?
Well, definitely Linux does dominate the operating systems. I mean, it is the most widely adopted for everything, not for like home, but not for home.
Right, exactly. And that was sort of my point. And like, not only that, but like, Windows and Apple suck. Like, they're not secure and they don't work particularly well. People might think they do just because they have been exposed to things that actually work well. But like, so I'm curious, like, there is a path to the future is what I'm seeing from both of you. That isn't just sort of like, oh, magically someone's going to have a breakthrough and we're going to have the kind of support we need of these projects to actually get them to be effective.
Yeah, and I think it's the business case. I think it's the business case of, large companies paying carriers a lot of money, right? So if you have someone with financial backing, a large corporation that's going to be paying, millions and billions of dollars for connectivity from Verizon or AT&T that says, okay, look, we could just build our own, and it's flexible and does all the things we want to do, that, that might change and propel the future. Also, I think that there's push from the government sector because they want more secure communication.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, what you're saying is, and to be clear for people who might be struggling a little bit, when you're seeing these corporations that are building these private LTE networks, right? It might be some company that we've never heard of that is like very wealthy, that is manufacturing stuff that we don't even think about in our lives that goes into something else. And they are doing this. And you're saying that they have an interest in having this software that they would want to use to manage their networks. Is that something I'm getting?
Think about something like FedEx, right? And all of their fleet vehicles and all of that. Think about how much money they pay for connectivity, and then all the, like, what about Starbucks? What do you think Starbucks internet bill is? So, they may not transform it right away, but there is a business case to start building networks with medium-sized or smaller companies that are going to democratize it for everyone.
And if, just to push back a little bit on Deb, this might be where we can get
joust.
Dynamic spectrum access devices do exist right now and have proven to be incredibly successful. There's a whole Dynamic Spectrum Access Alliance. They have like a worldwide conference every year. But, and this goes, I think, to Travis's point, the technologies are still not very user-friendly. They're very expensive often, right? Which is to say, I think what Deb's, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think what Deb's saying is like, the technology isn't yet ready for a farmer to deploy it themselves. Whereas what Deb's got and is working on, it's like, these are very accessible technologies that you can deploy now. But dynamic spectrum access and opportunistic spectrum access have been a battle that I've been on the front lines on in DC now for 15 years. Wow. And it's only due to the intransigence, this stubbornness in the face of science of the FCC, that we don't see more bands opened up for that kind of communication services, which then lead to the technologies being still in the geekosphere and still very expensive.
Can I just really quick, just 100% appreciate your work that you've been doing. And I want to wholeheartedly agree and add a proof point where we saw with 2.5 gigahertz, when tries went to deploy their network, that one of the largest market segment is by Cambium deploying an independent protocol that's not interoperable. It doesn't have any of those pieces of LTE, simply because, and it got much more widely adopted because it was easier. And I think you're 100% right. The reason why we're not seeing more is, of course, cost. But more importantly than cost, I think it is that educational lift.
And what's that educational lift? That this is desirable for outcomes X, Y, and Z, or something else?
Well, fixed wireless around 2004, 2005 was very popular, and it kind of mom and pops and smaller operators could take it and use it. Ubiquity really democratized ease of access for that. And so lots of entrepreneurial efforts sprung up. That hasn't happened yet for LTE, and that's kind of where we hope to, support that. But once we start seeing that for LTE, then I think we will democratize it. But right now, it's really, you need to be a network engineer.
Travis, I feel like you were starting to go down a path, and then we veered away from it.
No, I think Deb brings up a very interesting point, because if you've spent any time in the WISP community, here's the problem. Like Ubiquity and Cambium, you basically put up a sector, you put in a password, and you're on, right? If you've ever worked in the LTE world, it is quite a jump from the knowledge you need to operate on the back end. And then from a policy standpoint, I guess, does the FCC or the regulating bodies view the 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi spectrum as wildly successful deployment and utilization of the spectrum? Because I get the sense that the more spectrum we can allocate to independent operators and independent technology companies, the more, more some of this innovation can happen. But when they throttle us, like in the CBRS example, which I was 100% on board, but when you get a 10 megahertz slice of spectrum and you spent $25,000 to build out an LTE network, the math doesn't work, and that's sadly. So I'm with Deb. More power, more power, more power. And with Sasha, more access to spectrum. Until we can get those two things lined up, we're not even talking about getting access to mounting locations to physically put this stuff. Let's not even get there. But it's like, let's start with spectrum and power. But I just fear that it's going to be 10, 20 years from now, and we're going to be having the same conversation, because as Chris has taught me with these lobbyists, they have all the power, and if the lobbyist is Verizon, AT&T, Dish, and all these people, who moves the needle, I guess, would be my ultimate question.
So I think it's business case. I think there's a new business case that, mid-sized carriers, corporations, other people can have access to the spectrum. And I think they'll, to your point about lobbying efforts, what if there is that FedEx who is saying, look, I need to be able to build up my private network. I need access to spectrum.
Are you seeing, Deb, people creating businesses around going out to market private LTE solutions and things like that? Because I feel like that's what we need, right? Is those sorts of entrepreneurs who are going to sweet talk the people running those companies into saying, yeah, give this a try. This is really going to help you. It's going to be long-term successful. Like, they're not going to be out reading message boards and trying to figure it out for themselves, I'm guessing, so much as they need a vendor who's going to help them get them into it. At least that's how I assume the dynamic would be.
Yeah, well, Ericsson and Nokia are, the major players in the space, and they do see a business case to sell more equipment. And they're also, you see a lot of hardware companies looking at how can they utilize that as SaaS based, or even look at John Deere, right? John Deere's getting into the LTE business. I just came from the Industrial Grade Innovation Conference, really, really interesting. So much IoT on that space. Milwaukee has connectivity products, so
The power tool company.
Yes. Right. So and there's that opportunity. There's these there was these kits that they come in when there's a problem with the machinery, and they come in, it has like a PepaLink SD-WAN type aggregator, and so yeah, connectivity. Now they're still dealing with the terrible pain point of actually getting connectivity to the site. But there's more and more they're thinking about private LTE for supply line, for tracking, for smart ag, all these different end products. And there is a huge market booming there. To Sasha's point, we still haven't really quite solved the actual connectivity to the area problem yet.
I think part of this also comes down to risk tolerance and people's willingness to do the simple civil disobedience. And by that I mean, going back to your original example on DSL lines and early internet connectivity, and in essence, the nation as a whole started learning all about MAC spoofing and like copying the address from one computer to your router to allow you to break your acceptable use policy. But so many people did it that eventually the telcos relented. And the question in my mind is like, so what does happen when a farmer sets up their own little LTE network in the middle of nowhere?
Using spectrum that they've not been approved.
Using spectrum that's been licensed to someone that has no infrastructure and no intent to build any infrastructure in that community. I feel like that is an open question. And whereas, at some point, the FCC has to liberalize and change its spectrum policy. I've been working on this now for better part of 2 decades. And I'm telling you, like, man, the wheels go so slow. And the opportunity for the FCC to screw this up at the 11th hour and 59th minute, like they did with the television white space proceeding, is so high that, I think there is a place for civil disobedience in the space. And maybe that makes me a crazy radical, but having done that in the early days of the community broadband movement, I saw it being effective.
Right. I mean, pirate radio is an obvious analogy.
Absolutely.
It may get pushed by other
LPFM.
It's possible, I think, that push might come from other countries as well, right? So, you may find, LATAM or Africa or something like that, where they sort of skip over and start to push that, and that, that pushes that conversation more worldwide.
Travis, did you want to say? I want to address this question in the chat.
Well, let's hang on real quick. So I'll tell you what happens with spectrum. I mean, it's no secret in the WISP industry that there is spectrum being utilized all over the country that people are not authorized to use. It's near band spectrum and the only thing that happens is when somebody complains, then they will investigate it and you will get an order to stop transmitting. It's a really tough way to build a network, though. I mean, it works amazing until you get told to take it down, and then you have to tell your 1,000 users that were relying on that it no longer works. So, I mean, I would not advocate that people do that, but it's happening everywhere.
One thing that we did see with Ubiquiti, right? So Ubiquiti used to sell kind of open, more open source firmware, right? So people would tinker it to use frequency. They could, or they'd buy Argentinian, boxes. But what happened there, right? So the FCC then went after the manufacturer to lock down everything. So, there could be some unintended consequences of a purely, civil disobedience perspective. I think, we can push things from a business case. And this is why, why did torrenting turn into iTunes, right?
Yeah.
What a lot of people are doing is buying international radios. So you could buy international radios from all the major manufacturers. Heck, even some of the manufacturers, you could just put them into debug mode. You could use whatever spectrum you wanted. And a lot of people did it. I mean, and they still do it to this day, but I wouldn't advocate it. That's a tough way to build a very scalable system. And on the LTE front, what we've seen on these private LTE networks, just put in perspective, what we've seen is these are generally campus based. So I want to make sure people understand, I have yet to see, and maybe Deborah sees something different, where there's a company saying we're going to build a nationwide LTE network that we're going to operate exclusively on. I mean, there may be happening. I would tell you there's a limited number of mounting assets across the country. So yeah, that could happen for one or two until American towers are full. And then that's that. So
you can build more towers.
Well, well, you can, but building a tower here and there, but try to do it in metro areas, I will tell you that it's easier said than done.
I think also too, one of the things is that there is a lot of private dollars that do want to go into telecom assets, whether that's towers or fiber optic or whatever that looks like. So one of the things that's interesting too is that needs to happen, I think, for this to be transformative, is those funnels to be in place so that private equity dollars, small family offices, people with moderate sized wealth can own these different assets. And really, there isn't that investment market right now. So that will be also a really big part of this sort of transformative change.
Sasha, you were going to jump in there for a minute.
I mean, so, and there's lots of different hacks to this, right? So when in the 1800s, when a lot of like native tribes were forging treaties with the U.S., they kept any natural resources that they didn't give away. Now, clearly, since this is an age before wireless, they couldn't possibly have given away spectrum rights. And it's an open question. How is it that this natural resource has been stolen from Native Americans all across the country without remuneration?
Right. And I'll note Dara Blackwater has certainly been one to help publicize that. And I feel like my reaction to that, Sasha, is different knowing that Gorsuch is on the Supreme Court, where there are some votes to actually make good on historic promises and not to say, well, it would be inconvenient to actually live up to the contract we signed. So like there's not necessarily a majority on the Supreme Court on many cases on this, but it's not crazy to imagine that with the right amount of work that Supreme Court in the future decides that, yes, this paper with these signatures actually means something and tribes have a much greater access to spectrum.
I suppose we could even ask, does the FCC have a right to regulate their airwaves?
Yeah, I think that you could ask that question. It is hard for me to imagine a path where we don't come up with some justification for why the FCC does get to, just from a practical point of view and knowing that business rules this country. So, but I think these conversations can go in ways we may not predict.
Yeah, but you also have like a whole, this is only possible with a cabal that is maintaining artificial scarcity and price gouging simultaneously. There's a whole thing about the FTC being silent on these issues and not living up to its mission. There's a whole thing on the FCC not living up to its mission. There's a whole thing about the U.S. government not living up to its treaty obligations, and on and on. And so when I say like there's a place for civil disobedience, what I'm saying is like this is an unjust, unfair, oppressive system currently. And into that space, it's, I think, a question that should be talked about as to what is our role.
Hack the tractors. Like, we should have a hack the tractors movement.
Well, and I think that's the right to repair has a lot of that vibe of and I feel like hack the tractors. I love it, and I feel like historically that's the way the term hack has meant. I mean, you spend, I don't know, call me crazy. You spend a few $100,000, maybe $1 million or more on some of this stuff. You should probably have some kind of right to modify it as you see fit without having to get the permission of John Deere. So I want to address something though that EJ asked in the question a little while back. In particular, I think we talked a little bit about what is open, some of the unlicensed bands. I don't know if there's anything we want to add to that. I know that Travis, you're excited about 5.9 gigahertz opening up. But what is coming forward? I mean, is this something where like, the 12 gigahertz proceeding is relevant? There's not a lot of bands, right? But 12 is one that's coming. What else should we be thinking about along these lines?
I mean, the NTA has been in 20 years of internal discussion to make additional bans, federal bans, new bans available publicly. And, there's a lot of navel gazing in there, and they always say we need to do this, and they always don't do that. I think a lot of this comes down to the lack of accountability for people to do their job, which is be servants of the public interest in this space. But again, going back to what Travis is saying, when we talk about like, where are we going to get the spectrum? It's like, this isn't a technical issue. This isn't an availability issue. This is like a licensure, regulatory, political problem.
It's a political decision.
The spectrum's there. Like, we just don't use it, and we create an ever increasing series of regulatory monstrosities to prevent us from using it, right? You now have to hack firmware to prevent people from tuning in channels 12, 13, and 14 on Wi-Fi, because people were doing that because it was available. And now they're like, okay, let's spend some money to make it impossible to do that thing.
It doesn't have to be regulatory though, as well. I mean, there is carriers that have underutilized assets on all these spectrum assets on their book. And like my point earlier, it's not really working for them either, right? They're not really, it doesn't there's no business use case if you're spending $1,000 to acquire a customer for a rural community with 600 homes. But, they don't necessarily want to move it outside of their assets as well. So what are the things that we can do from a business perspective is allow them to, allow like new practices around subleasing and, have ways that they can utilize that spectrum. They can get revenue. The communities can use it. And I think that's exciting as well. We can move forward with that now, even if, the regulatory bodies are historically very, 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 very slow.
I feel like we're heading into the period of talking about this subject where we're like college students experimenting with certain substances in an evening and being like, hey man, like what if we like did things totally differently? And so like actually I think that's fascinating, right? In part because of the system that we have, right? If you want to say like I give up, and I'm not saying that you're saying this, Deb, but like one path is like if you give up on the idea that like the FCC could act in a way that is contrary to the interests of of Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, and you say, what can we just do with existing law and practice, right? Well, these companies have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize revenue, and if one could convince, whether it's shareholders or others that have power, to say these companies are missing out on hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars of revenue per year because they're not subleasing this space, and then that gets pretty interesting, I think. But it does leave us, I think, with further cementing in this idea that they get to choose how to use these public airwaves in that way. And so, it's a pretty significant decision as to how to proceed.
Yeah, I think that it's more so, about, I mean, one of the reasons is that the FCC is involved in this too. So when you do sublease or you sell an asset, you have to register with the FCC. So sort of making that whole process more streamlined. And again, I think it also comes back into like, what if private dollars were able to invest in spectrum, right? What if you weren't a carrier or weren't a carrier in the traditional sense? So, I tend to think that new markets will also push open this question as well and give us different options to sort of, it's a multifaceted battle. You never fight a battle on one front. So Sasha's over there helping us with the regulatory stuff. We're doing some interesting things. I think it's a multi-front battle.
And I think it's important to learn from history, right? The reason why we have the the Carter Phone Supreme Court decision is that people started doing civil disobedience. That led to the opening up of AT&T's network, which made the computer modem legal, right? It was not legal until then, which allowed the internet to exist in the first place. Now they're claiming, no, we could never do this kind of distributed network because it'd be chaos and the network would be harmed. And I'm like, well, there's actually a harm principle. You can't disallow something unless you can demonstrate harm. And I have a hard time understanding how I can harm a network that doesn't exist in much of rural America. And so, again, I would say, no, it's not a radical position. It's saying these precedents have already been set in telecommunications history. We should follow what happened before, because that actually was successful in creating the internet. in the first place.
We got to lead toward wrapping up, but Travis, you had unmuted yourself for a second there.
No, I think from my perspective, I would rather see more power and less spectrum as the next step. So if they could increase power in the 6 gig band and in the 5.9, and that's the 6 gig band is a large swath of spectrum. I think that would do more good in the short term while we go for some of these aspirational goals. The other question I guess I had before we go is we talk about the spectrum, but when people buy blocks of spectrum, or companies do, or investment houses do, that's their asset, isn't it? It no longer belongs to, it's no longer open for anyone to use. So, don't you think it would just be such a radical shift and maybe unachievable shift to have all the spectrum be re-put back into the public domain and divvied back out? I'm just curious logistically and politically if that could ever even happen.
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend doing that. In fact, I'm not for like the seizure of spectrum, but what I am for is kind of a use it or lose it, or use it or share it mandate, which is to say,
isn't there something
you don't
in
get
there
to squander this public resource. You don't get to squander the public airwaves and charge predatory pricing because you've got an artificial scarcity caused by a government issued monopoly. I'm saying, like, look, use it. But if you're not using it, you don't get to just hoard it. That's all.
And isn't that what happened with dish networks though? Didn't they have a timeline where they had to use the spectrum or they lost it? Isn't that kind of already in play or not?
Well, that was from, I think, a specific merger requirement.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
so that kind of concept has happened.
We refuse to make policy effectively. Instead, we tack it on to some merger requirements so we get some good policy here and there for short term.
Well, if you could make some policy, let's turn up the juice on the 6 gig spectrum. And then I think that would do a lot of good to get us at least something in the near future.
All right, I want to address one last comment. We've had a lot of really great comments from people, but I just wanted to throw this one at Deb and give her a chance to respond back. Matt Larson's friend of the show. So what do you say? Oh, and for people who might be listening on audio only, it says mesh networks, especially ones dependent on residential rooftops, have not scaled. There's a long history of it being a failure. And I'll just also note that
really great
Mesh
comment.
NYC would disagree, but go ahead.
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. And I think it's because when we traditionally think about networks, we think about the infrastructure layer and the service and OpEx layer, where the operational part of it, as being one company, right? But models like what we saw in Ammon, Idaho, right, where the infrastructure can be, owned, municipally, but many different providers can provide coordination and service and give users choice. That sort of makes it really interesting. And that's kind of what we're doing at Althea. You can have infrastructure owners, and then you have a different coordinated layer. But just having, people be sort of responsible for their own coordination. Radio needs a lot of coordination in order for it to be really, really effective, especially when we're going to licensing, and there's safety reasons and things like that too. So I think the important part about the reasons why it didn't work is because there wasn't a sort of, approach to how do we incentivize a separate management layer. And I think that's really, really critical if we're going to have decentralized networks.
Yeah, and I would just say it really depends on what you're talking about in terms of mesh and what you're talking about in terms of scale. So by 2005, we were building multiple metro scale mesh networks all around the globe. It was pretty standard to have fairly distributed ad hoc systems. This isn't to say there weren't some components that sometimes were architected to be hierarchical within those meshes.
Right.
But in fact, it is scalable. And, I think where we might disagree is really on like a particular form of ad hoc mesh scaling up to a certain scale based on certain protocols because of the overhead that would then flow over the network itself, in which case I would vociferously agree that that's not a scalable system.
Right.
But again, those networks run into the buzzsaw of destabilizing a dominant business model that is much better capitalized and has a much better PR campaign and lobbying efforts behind it. But you could easily share connectivity at scale of communities, neighborhoods, and even cities via a distributed sometimes even ad hoc infrastructure.
And we have one final question that Travis can be brief on. Did you turn on the Tirana pilot on Tuesday? And how is it going?
It is up and running, and testing is actually happening as we are speaking here. So I don't have a lot of data yet, but I did have a nice kind of some interesting technical conversations on how people think it works. So I'm going to I will be able to report back in on the next episode, and then I'll be able to also report in, is it even technical or is it even financially viable? Because the one thing we haven't spoke of here is the problem I feel in the wireless industry is we have been spoiled with the $100 radios, the $100 clients, and the $300 access points. So when people have that in their mind, and when you come to them with a $100,000 tower and a $1,000 client, the math changes. So we need to talk about the technical viability of Tirana and the financial feasibility of it. So those will be things I can report in next time. But I will say, Sasha, as somebody that ran a 2,500 node mesh network in a metro area, terrible technology. So I'll just leave you at that. But
this has been a fun show. I really appreciate Deb and Sasha, not just coming on the show and doing great, but also putting up with my scheduling. And I'll say that the thing that this show needs more than anything is a scheduler. Because Rye does a great job with the engineering. We could always, like with a technical person that had more time, we could do more things. But I feel bad for what I put my guests through as we're trying to find time. So thank you so much.
Hey, what about me?
You're always available. You're just hanging out.
Sorry I was late today, guys. Thanks for the conversation. Very interesting.
And we will be back next week, I hope. I just sent out a proposed time to Kim and Doug for Thursday. We'll see if we can make that happen, sort of slip it in between my odd schedule of September. But otherwise, we'll be back as soon as we can with another episode. But Deb and Sasha, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Take care, everyone.
It's been a fun episode of Connect This.